Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good day. I'll be talking about expanding clinicians' attentional focus by starting to include the assessment of executive functions in the identification and assessment and diagnosis of ADHD. Quickly here, want to go over the agenda for today. So I'm going to provide a brief introduction to executive function. I'm going to talk briefly about ADHD as an impaired executive function process. And then I'm going to talk about the assessment of ADHD and then focusing most of the session on using rating scales assessments of executive function to identify ADHD. Those specific scales that we'll be talking about are the Brown Executive Function Attention Scales, the DREP, the BASC-3 Executive Function Index. And then finally, I will talk briefly about how some of the results from those measures can be used in guiding interventions. All right, executive function and regulation skills are the mental processes that enable us to plan, focus, attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks successfully. The brain needs these skills to filter out distractions, prioritize tasks, set and achieve goals. All right. There are several underlying brain processes that allow us to engage in executive function. Executive function involves self-regulatory skills that depend on three brain functions: working memory, mental flexibility, and self-control. Working memory governs our ability to retain and manipulate distinct pieces of information over a short period of time, to recall whether we have added salt to our cooking right after we have helped our child find their missing shoe. Mental flexibility helps us to sustain or shift attention in response to different demands, to apply different roles in different settings. We teach our children about outside voices and inside voices. That executive function allows them to differentiate situations where they should use each. Self-control enables us to set priorities and resist impulses. It's what I like to call keeping us away from the bright and shiny. This is the kind of skill that keeps us from going to Office Depot for printer paper and coming home with a brand new Microsoft Surface Book. Okay, there are several steps involved in executive function. Okay, these steps include analyzing a task, planning how to address the task, organizing the steps needed to carry out a task, developing timelines for completing a task, and adjusting or shifting the steps if needed to complete the task, and then finally completing the task in a timely way. Executive functions, the development of executive functions start with children at a very young age, but children are not born with these skills. They're born with the potential to develop them. Executive function capacity develops through childhood into adolescence and beyond. It is not fully present in early childhood. Environmental demands for executive functions increase with age, from preschool through adulthood, and executive functions often are not noticeable until age 12. All right, here's kind of a graph that looks at, the development of executive functions. As you can see, they develop through early childhood, most of the development happening after age of 3 or 4. So they also will then impact a person's life at different areas during their lifetime. So in school, executive functions help children remember and follow multi-step instructions, avoid distractions, control rash responses, and adjust when rules change. In terms of positive behavior, executive functions help children develop skills or teamwork, the skills of teamwork, leadership, decision-making, working towards a goal, critical thinking, adaptability, and being aware of our own emotions and those of others. So it impacts the child and the adults, the child, the adolescent, and the adults' choices in their lives, so that it can impact their health. So by using executive functioning skills, we make more positive choices about our nutrition and about our exercise. We also tend to resist pressure from taking risks or trying drugs. Also, executive functions help us in our work environment as we become adults. So we become more successful if we use these skills, since it increases our potential for success because we're better organized, able to solve problems and that require planning, and are prepared to adjust to the challenges and circumstances in the work environment. All right. Here are some of the challenges Here are some of the challenges that are associated with poor executive functioning. Trouble organizing materials and work, trouble completing tasks, trouble managing time, and trouble managing attention. These also impact the person's ability to interact socially with others. All right. All right, in this next section, I'm going to talk about ADHD as impaired executive functioning. So ADHD as a deficit that involves impaired executive functioning. Scientific research for over the past 30 years has brought a major change in our understanding of ADHD. Once thought to be a disorder of disruptive behavior in childhood, the new understanding of ADHD is that it's a developmental impairment of the brain's self-management system, its executive functions. In a recent article written by Russell Barkley, he described the executive functions and how they are found in the ADH brain. He defines the what circuit as going from the frontal lobe to the back areas of the brain called the basal ganglia. It is linked to working memory. So it is the circuit that what we think starts to guide what we do. This is particularly true when it comes to plans, goals, and the future. The when circuit, this circuit goes from the same prefrontal areas to the cerebellum, and when improperly functioning, the when circuit in persons with ADHD explains why they often have a problem with time management. The Y circuit, the third circuit, also originates in the frontal lobe and goes through the central part of the brain, known as the anterior cingulate to the amygdala. This is the gateway of the limbic system, and this is the area in which our emotions are stored, or our emotional functioning is stored. So this is where what we think controls how we feel, and vice versa, what we feel can control what we think. And then finally, the who circuit. This final circuit goes from the frontal lobe to the very back of the hemisphere. It is where self-awareness takes place. This is where self-management skills reside, and this is an area that needs much further development in students with ADHD. And this is why. Because when we look at ADHD and in terms of deficits related to ADHD to executive functions, we see that individuals with ADHD have problems with self-restraint, self-awareness, self-speech, self-sensing and imagery, self-control of emotions, self-motivation, and self-directed problem solving. It's not that they don't want to engage in these behaviors, but they have trouble engaging themselves in those behaviors that would help to make them successful. All right, in this next section, we're going to talk about, the assessment of ADHD. All right, according to DuPaul, when we are venturing to identify and assess attention deficit disorder in a person, there are the following recommended procedures that should be used to help identify clients with ADHD. First, we should engage in screening. Screening is where we use a brief measure that either a performance measure or a rating scale that can be used to identify those students who are clients who are at risk for attentional deficits. And if we've identified those individuals as being at risk with attentional deficits, we can use multiple assessments to further define the deficits and the symptomology that they have and help in the diagnostic process, which is the third step, classification and diagnosis. And then after diagnosing, we can then engage in interventions. And now the thing is that often we'll skip, in some settings, we will skip step 3 and go straight into doing interventions. Also, we want to make sure that when we're doing interventions that they are aligned with the information that we collected in the first 3 steps. And then finally, we would want to monitor, which is after providing interventions or strategies for support, we want to reevaluate the client to determine if they're improving, but then also to determine the effectiveness of the interventions. All right, DuPaul suggests that we don't use a single source of information for assessment or measure, and because that is not sufficient in the identification of ADHD. He focused a lot of what he was doing with children, but that adage can be used with adult subjects, adolescent subjects, as well as children. Current best practices in evaluating children, though, requires the use of multiple assessment methods and sources of information. Methods include rating, observations, formal tests, and performance measures. Sources include parents, teachers, the child, clinicians, other educational professionals, the home, and in the home, school, and clinical setting. So again, here are some of the assessment tools that we could use in the assessment of ADHD. Again, we want to make sure that we are doing assessment in multiple environments, including the home and if it's students in the school. We also want to get information from multiple sources. So if we're working with students, we would want to get the teachers, the student themselves, and the parents to fill out, to participate in the assessment process. Okay, so we have task-oriented measures, things that measure performance, things that, assessments that measure things like shifting attention, focusing attention, working memory. Then we have rating scales, which uses the perception of the client themselves as well as the perceptions of if it's a child, their parents, if they're in school, the teachers. Then we can also use structured interviews as well as structured observations. All right, in this next section, we're going to focus on the assessment of executive functions. Today, there are many measures of executive functions. Today, we're going to focus on 3 rating scales of executive function. There are other measures, performance measures like CogMed that measure working memory. My colleague Peter is going to be doing an assessment of, an assessment and intervention of ADHD presentation on the 24th, and he'll be talking some about CogMed and working memory if you're interested in that. But for our presentation today, we are going to focus on 3 rating scales. We're going to be focusing on the Brown Executive Function and Attention Scale, the DREF, and the BASC-3 Executive Function Index. So the Brown Executive Function Attention Scales is based on the idea that ADHD is a complex syndrome, that it involves developmental impairment of executive functions, that the self-management system of the brain, a system of mostly unconscious operation, and that these impairments are situationally variable. They can be chronic and significantly interfere with functioning in many aspects of a person's life. All right, Dr. Brown developed a model of executive functions. So the Brown scales are designed to measure this broader notion of attention as a dynamic group of interacting executive functions and potential impairments. Items on the Brown scales are grouped into 6 clusters based on Dr. Brown's model. These clusters are activation, and that's where these are items that get to the organizing, prioritizing, and activating skills that a student has or has deficit with. The focus area, which is focusing, sustaining a focus, and shifting focus of attention. The effort construct, which is the regulating alertness, sustaining effort, and processing speed. The emotions construct of the model, which looks at the individual's ability to manage frustration and modulate emotions and use emotions appropriately. The 5th area is memory, and this is focusing on working memory, and accessing recall. And then finally, the action construct, which the action construct involves monitoring and self-regulating action. So this would be the self-management area. And the Brown Executive Function Attention Scales will have items that reflect each of these 6 areas. All right. The age ranges for the different forms on the Brown are there's a children's form, which is ages 3 through 7, an adolescent form, which is ages 8 through, or pre-adolescent form, which is ages 8 through 12, an adolescent form, ages 13 through 18, and then a adult form, ages 19 plus. For children, there's a parent and teacher form. For pre-adolescents, there's a parent, teacher, and self form. For adolescents, there's a parent and self form, and then for the adults, there's a self form. The qualification level, it's a B qualification level. The administration can be done either with paper or pencil or digitally. It's available on Q Global for scoring, but it can also be scored manually. Okay, some of the distinguishing features of the Brown are that it's clinical and research. It is based on clinical and research-based anchoring. So the scales measure symptoms of ADHD directly and quantifiably. Cluster elevations, or elevations in each of those 6 areas, and the profile configurations derived from the test results can be used to suggest possible diagnosis as well as testable hypotheses, as well as suggest possible interventions or strategies for support. The items are more specific and contextual. Patients with ADHD experience much situational variability with the ability to focus on specific activities which hold strong interest for them, but then have limited ability to focus on less interesting tasks. The Brown scale includes items that ask about the difficulties encountered in specific contexts. So difficulties remembering what has been read when the assignment is something that is not of your interest is an example of one of the items. Okay. It's also a multiple perspective assessment. Again, as we've mentioned, we get perspectives from different raters. We can have, for students, we'll have that are over the age of 8, they'll have a self-report. Their teachers can provide a report, and their parents can as well. Another thing is that distinguishes the Brown from other rating scales is that it focuses on severity as opposed to frequency. Items on the Brown focus on severity of the specific problems rather than how often they occur. This allows examinees to report more accurately about how difficult the person's experiences with each symptom are. Also, it's aligned with the DSM-5 symptoms and more in that it also includes a scale of emotions which is not identified in the DSM-5 as an area or a criteria for ADHD. All right. There are several applications of the Brown Executive Functioning Attention Scales. One is for preliminary screening. This process for identifying executive functioning strengths and areas of needs. And it also can be used to guide interventions that are used immediately after screening. So if we're using it in a school environment, and we are using it at Tier 1, we could use the screener and then, based on the information, provide suggestions for supports and different strategies. It also can be used as a comprehensive evaluation. It can be used with other measures to help in the diagnostic process. It also can be used to progress monitor. It can be used to progress monitor not only behavioral-based interventions, but it can also be used in tri-rating medicine dosages to determine the impact or the effectiveness of different prescription medicines for ADHD. And then finally, it can be used in research where it establishes the executive function the theory of executive functions and supports that use with students with attention deficit disorder. Okay. All right, the Brown model of executive function impairment, the different symptom characteristics, again, that are included in the items are that the symptom characteristics are dimensional, not all or nothing. So it talks about the degree or how chronic a impairment is. And again, they're situational. So they talk about the items ask about symptoms if in different situations. So if a student is, or if a person is doing something they're interested in versus something that they are asked to do that does not hold their interest. All right, and here's an example of the items. So in the items, we ask again how big of a problem it is. No problem, a little problem, a medium problem, or a big problem. And again, the items are worded so that we take into consideration different situations. All right, when we're scoring the Brown scales, we look at scores that are 70 and above on a T-score range that determines very atypical attentional performance, and this indicates a very significant problem. Again, and then with scores of 54 and below, the problem is not significant. And different proficiency or different areas of at risk are in between those levels. Okay, and here's an example of a summary score. You could see if you're doing a parent and a teacher form, you will have both the parent and the teacher to compare how they're viewing the student. Okay. In this next section, I will be talking about the Delis rating of executive functions. Okay, the Delis rating of executive functions can be used by clinicians and school psychologists working in a variety of settings and can be used to evaluate children with ADHD, traumatic brain injury, autism, Asperger's syndrome, neurological and psychiatric disorders, learning disabilities. They can use to help enable the identification of patterns of clinical relevant symptoms. It can be used to identify symptoms that create the most stress for an individual, but also create the most stress for parents and teachers who are working with children. And it can identify symptoms relative to the DSM-5. It tracks changes in behavior, so it can be used in progress monitoring after using interventions. Okay, the part one of it's set up in two parts of the Delis rating of executive functioning scales. Part one is 36-item rating scale that has a parent and teacher and child form. Self-report is used for ages 11 through 18. They are asked to fill out the form and the specific items in terms of how often or the frequency that a behavior happens. So they're asked to fill out if it's sometimes or never, monthly, weekly, or daily. The second section is a checklist of stressors to help prioritize interventions. So in the first part, we use the Delis to determine the frequency of different symptoms. In the second part, the student or the child, the parent or a teacher will prioritize those stressors or those issues in terms of how stressful they are for the subject. All right, the DREF has specific core indices that it can be used to identify and assess the level of functioning of the student. The three core indexes are behavioral function, or the ability to regulate behavior to meet demands of the environment; executive functioning, the ability to regulate emotional functioning, executive functioning, the higher level cognitive ability to adapt and function, and then there's a total composite score, which provides an overall view of the ability to plan, execute, regulate cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functions. Okay, and here's example of some of the items that are included in the scale to assess for those core indices. So on the parent form, there are things, you're asking in terms of behavioral functioning, the parent is asked to determine how often the child acts silly or childish. In emotional functioning, how often do they show outbursts of anger? In executive functioning, how often does the child lose track of what he or she is supposed to be doing due to noise or something else going around? For the self form, there are similar items. The client is asked or the child is asked, I do things without thinking is one item. I try to control my anger, but I just can't. And again, they indicate how often this occurs. The DREF also has specific executive function core indexes that are related to attention and working memory. There's the attention working memory index, which provides information about inattention, deficits in multitasking, disorganization. There's an activity level impulse control index, in which items reflect hyperactivity, impulsivity, and poor self-monitoring. There's a compliance anger management index, which the symptoms reflect their ability to control their mood and their emotions, to deal with frustration. And then finally, there's an abstract thinking or problem-solving index, and items there, and it's only on the parent and teacher forms, and items there reflect concrete thinking, cognitive rigidity, poor decision-making, and poor problem-solving skills. Okay, and then here are some of the items that reflect those indexes. And then here's an example of the self-report form. And then an example of the report that comes from assessing the student. And you can see there's the core indexes and the clinical indexes. And I'm sorry, I was calling the clinical indexes, the second one's core indexes as well. But they were the clinical indexes. So you'll have a score that is, or scores for both of those indices, or sets of indices. And then the report will also break it down into the raw score, the T-scores, and the percentile rankings, and the confidence intervals related to the student's or the subject's score. All right. In this next section, I'm going to be talking about the BASC-3. Now, the BASC-3 has some attentional or attention and hyperactive based indexes or scales, but it also has an executive function scale. The BASC-3, if you're familiar with the BASC-3, or it is a family of assessments, which include self-report measures, which we'll focus on today, the teacher, parent, and student self-reports, or child or adult self-reports. But it also includes, along with that, a self-report of personality. It also includes observations and interviews to take history. And then it also includes something called flex monitoring, which is a way of progress monitoring using the rating scales. Now, in terms of what we'll be looking at today, which is the rating scales, the rating scales for the student are available. There's a scale for children. There's ages 6 through 7. There's a form for children ages 8 through 11. There's a form for adolescents, and there's a form for adults ages 18 through 25. The parent scales there's a form for children 2 through 5, 6 through 11, and 12 through adulthood or young adulthood. And then finally, there are teacher scales that are available for the similar age groups. All right, and here are on the teacher and parent forms the two attentional clinical attention deficit related clinical scales, attention problems and hyperactivity. And like I said, there's also an executive function content scale, and the executive function content scale includes items that help determine the subject's ability to control behavior by planning, anticipating, inhibiting, or maintaining goal-directed activities, and by reacting appropriately to their environmental feedback in a purposeful and meaningful way. Okay, here are some of the indexes that are or some of the items that are included, types of items that are included in the executive functioning indexes and the indexes themselves. So there's an overall executive functioning index, and that is made up of an attentional control index, an emotional control index, a behavioral control index, and a problem-solving index. In the attentional control index, it includes items like is easily distracted, has short attention span. The behavioral control index includes items like has poor self-control. The emotional one includes things like gets angry easily. And then the problem-solving index includes items like takes a step-by-step approach to work, finds ways to solve a problem. All right, the executive functioning index is comprised of items from all the overall index scores comprised from items from the other executive functioning indexes. So it gives an overall score of executive functioning as well as a score for those specific indexes. The high scores indicate a pervasive problem with self-regulation in multiple domains of executive functioning. The high scores indicate that the subject may have many ADHD-like symptoms and are often diagnosed with ADHD or other self-regulatory disorders. Individuals with high scores fail to successfully engage in age-appropriate levels of day-to-day planning, problem-solving, and organization necessary for success in most learning environments. All right, and here's an example of a report from the BASC where it is included with other content scale scores that include things like anger control, bullying, but we'll focus on the executive functioning. So this is the subject's T-score on the executive functioning is 60 according to the printout, and that has a percentage rank of 83. This T-score falls in the at-risk classification. So it gives us an idea if a subject is at risk for having executive functioning deficits. The report also provides a look at the specific indexes that are included in the overall executive functioning index. So it'll provide information about problem solving, attentional control, behavioral control, and emotional control. So much like I described in the overall, it'll give a readout of the subject scores, the percentile ranking, and if they're at risk. All right, in this last section, what I'm going to want to talk about is how we can use information from our assessments to guide interventions. So again, I want to first repeat the whole idea that when we use these assessments or these rating scales that I've talked about, this is not going to, we can't use a single scale to diagnose a subject with ADHD. These scales are going to be used within a multi-assessment evaluation where we use other evaluations and assessments in order to provide a more valid diagnosis. So when we're using this information, though, we can use this information with subjects who are diagnosed, but then also subjects who are just showing deficits in specific executive functioning area. All right, here's an example of the Brown scales, a report that I showed one earlier. And in this case, we have results from 3 raters, the student, the parent, and the teacher. And we can say that there's some similarities and that this information can be also helpful in determining where we want to use specific interventions, as well as the types of interventions that we want to use. We can see that in terms of activation, that all 3 raters, the parent, the student, and the teacher, rated the student's performance in those areas as being significantly atypical or significantly at risk to having a problem in that area. We can also see the teacher felt that the student's efforts executive functions related to effort was also significant, and the student found that their ability to control their emotions was also highly atypical. So again, this is information that we can then use when we are using the assessments and the screening to guide interventions. When we're using the Brown, what we do is use 3 different phases. And the first phase, which I skipped when I was talking about it, was to examine the overall composite score. Oh, so let's go back. Oh, so. All right, the overall composite score, as we see, is not quite at the 70 level, but it is at the 60 level, 60 T-score, so above that, so it's moderately atypical. So again, when we are looking at using the results from the Brown, the first phase is to look at that overall score. So we have a student that has an overall executive functioning deficit, most likely. So they're at risk for that, at least. And then the second phase is to examine the different clusters. And that's what I did briefly in going over. And when you do that, you want to, again, look at the specific clusters of activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action, but then also look at the different, if you have multiple people filling out the form, you want to look at any differences or similarities in those specific clusters. And then the final phase is to look at specific items. And the Brown allows us to look at the specific items in the scale and identify which items are elevated. So in this example, in the effort section, all all three raters, the parent, the student, and teacher, thought that there was a big problem that the child had with needs to be reminded to get started or keep working on tasks to get them done or complete them. So this could help in terms of developing specific accommodations or specific strategies. These items can kind of direct those strategies that you might want to use with the student in order to address the specific areas that they show deficit in executive functioning. All right. All right, the second part of the Delis rating of executive functioning scale, again, provides a prioritized list of top stressors. So the subject or the student or the parent or teacher who are filling out the form then will rate the specific items in how much of a stressor they are in the subject's life. So the top stressors section is a list of the items and the raters responding to those items. And these are the items that are most problematic for the subject. So for this example of a 9-year-old, the most stressful symptoms, as reported by the mother, were related to angry outbursts, disruptive behavior, poor frustration and tolerance, impulsivity, and lack of effort. A review of specific endorsed items indicated a profile of inattention, distractibility, forgetfulness, impulsivity, hyperactivity, and disruptive behaviors, and a poor frustration tolerance. So when we look at the specific, then we can go and look at the specific items, and similar to what we did with the Brown item analysis, look at those items and how they're rated, and then use those items in developing accommodations or strategies of support or interventions. All right. In this next slide, we're looking at some of the information that is provided by the BASC to support interventions for students who have been assessed using the BASC series of evaluations. The BASC has a psychosocial interventions guide that was written by Kimberly Van Ness, Cecil Reynolds, and Randy Camphouse, that is directly aligned with the assessment, with the rating scales. So the information that comes from the rating scales then can be used by an individual who is providing interventions and supports for the student or the child or the subject, and can go into that intervention guide, select the appropriate intervention based on the assessment results, and then follow the steps that are included in that guide to provide that intervention. In this case, we're looking at the interventions for attention, and one of those interventions is self-management, which is self-management is a major component of executive functions. So within the guide, there's a statement or a description of what self-management is. It provides specific examples of self-management, both when self-management is used appropriately and inappropriately. It also describes some of the goals that you would use and objectives in order to improve a subject's self-management skills. And then finally, that it provides a step-by-step instructions on how to prepare to use an intervention or support for self-management, and then how to implement those supports or those strategies for the intervention. All right. I want to thank you for attending